Hello and welcome to everyone who is joining us today. So over the last few days, Citeline's Clinical Connection Digital Week series has been tackling various industry themes like decentralized trials, diversity in clinical trials, and disclosure and data. And today we wrap up our series with perspectives on trial participation, really grounding ourselves in our shared mission to improve human health and peering through the lens of three speakers who represent the voices of patients, caregivers, and the organizations that support an individual's healthcare journey. So I am Haley Quinn, your moderator today. I'll flip slides. I need to remember to do that. So I am Haley Quinn, your moderator today. My professional experience spans across health-driven nonprofit organizations, patient community building, patient-led collaborations within the life sciences sector, and bringing me to my current role leading go-to-market activities for Citeline Connect patient engagement and recruitment solutions. And in my personal life, my experience as a rare disease patient has certainly shaped my outlook on how innovation and collaboration can facilitate meaningful outcomes in healthcare. Joined with me today is Austin LeClaire, an esteemed rare disease patient advocate living with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Austin has openly shared his experience as a clinical trial participant and young adult navigating mobility and the complexities of healthcare. Austin has been involved in multiple patient committees, speaking engagements, and congressional and regulatory briefings. He currently holds a board member position at One Rare, a nonprofit forum to meet the needs of young adults living with rare disease and chronic conditions. So Austin, so glad to have you with us today. Followed by Austin is Jen McNary. She wears multiple hats. She is a mother, speaker, advocate, thought leader, advisor, and is a trusted voice in the rare disease community. Her experience in clinical research includes involvement in the drug development process for all 5 FDA-approved drugs for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, organizing the largest FDA advisory committee hearing in history in her previous role at a Massachusetts-based nonprofit. She is the co-founder and principal of Canary Advisors, a boutique patient advocacy consulting firm with a focus on regulatory and access patient engagement. And additionally, Jen is the founder of One Rare. Thank you, Jen, for being here with us. And lastly, we have Gene Jay. He is the head of clinical trial solutions at Evernorth, an organization championing affordable, predictable, and simple healthcare through their world-class pharmacy care and benefit solutions. In his current role, Gene leads a data analytics group that leverages medical and pharmacy data to identify the right member for the right drug trial, as well as the right data analytics solutions for plan sponsors. He has an extensive history of developing and implementing clinical programs, combining his deep knowledge of the clinical experience and medical data to spearhead industry innovation. So glad to have you all here, Austin, Gene, and Jay, or Jen. To our audience here with us today, I encourage you to ask questions as our discussion on how we open more doors to clinical research for patients and their communities unfolds. We want to make sure you make the most of your time today and have experts on the line who can help you do just that. So that's more to say, don't be shy to use the chat feature throughout this session because we will have time at the end for Q&A. All right. So many times patients who are actually willing to participate are oftentimes starting their journey at a disadvantage. They live too far away. They don't know where or who to turn to for information on their care options, or the possibilities of their unique situations are simply overlooked during protocol development. The industry has been called to involve those individuals with valuable lived health experience that can help us to shape the way that we design and conduct clinical trials. Yet actualizing patient involvement still may seem like a light that's too far away in the distance. So I wanted to start off our discussion by opening our conversation to Austin and Jen around how they've helped to design and run more accessible trials and what that impact was.
So I'll start off because today, although I'm Austin's mother, I also work professionally in the industry. So this is a little bit more of a question about engaging with patients in various disease states to help get their insights as you design a study that they ultimately have to be comfortable with and have to participate in. So one of the mechanisms that are easily utilized when a trial sponsor is looking to design a clinical trial, especially where we're more focused in rare disease, is to talk to patients. And that seems like really kind of, for me, it seems like an obvious choice is to understand from the people who are going to be utilizing clinical trial to find out if the study that you're designing is something that is going to work for them. Austin and I together and our family, including both of his little brothers, have participated in clinical trials for well over a decade. And there's still a ton of work to be done there. So you ask patients, you show them the design, and you present to them the schedule of assessments and really get in the weeds. Where are the locations of the studies? What's going to be necessary in order to participate? And then you listen. You find out from those experts, from those patients, is that going to be feasible? Is that going to be something that they can do? And as a patient and as a family, we always, whether they like it or not, provide direct feedback about studies and about designs and about questions that we might have in the process.
Can you share possibly an example of what that has looked like, just to help the audience kind of wrap their minds around this concept of really kind of that open dialogue?
Sure. So, first you have to understand that most trial participants are not Austin and I, right? So most trial participants are not people who have open lines of communication directly with sponsors, either running their study or running other studies. So we are a little bit of the exception there. But in terms of our, examples on our end, we've been able to talk about, and Austin can attest to this. Austin is more advanced Duchenne patient, and he has an implanted portacath. And so the trial was the trial that he's participating in was designed where in the protocol there's only peripheral sticks, so only accessing veins for blood draws. Well, that doesn't work real well for Austin because it's really easy for him to blow veins. So Austin, what did we end up doing? How did we make that change?
So we ended up finding out that there's only 2 labs in the entire world that can't be done through a portacath. So we talked to one of the trial coordinators and we discussed if there was any valid reason of why I should do it. And we figured out there isn't. It was just that was the most effective way that was the best way they thought of doing it. So we eventually talked to them and we realized there was no reason I shouldn't use my portacath. So we came to an agreement that would be reasonable to use.
Right. And so the trials staff was really great about going back to the sponsor and saying, hey, we have a valid request here, and the risk of port infection is much more minimal than the risk of blowing these veins. And so we'd like to have an amendment and be allowed to use that portacath. And that was an agreement that was made. And maybe the way that you get around something like that is having a conversation when you move into a different population, a different patient group. You might want to ask that population, maybe it's not a concern for the young kids with this disease, but for older guys, peripheral access is really hard.
Yeah. That's a great point that you bring up. And Austin, kind of that insight around actually participating in a trial, but also feeling empowered to express your needs. And they, to your point, are very valid concerns. So I'm wondering if you have any insight to add into kind of how we can run more accessible trials, or even thinking about this idea of patient centricity. It's such a concept that is talked about so often, but like, what exactly does that look like in practice to you as somebody who is living through this and, navigating these waters?
Yeah, so patient centricity, I think it's really important that you're supposed to be focusing on the patients. But I've noticed in a lot of my experience, it's getting the data, and the actual data is what, and getting the clinical trial done. I've seen they consider that they're more focused on that than necessarily how the patient will be able to go through the trial and like how their experience would be. So it's really important to like focus on how you're getting that data from the patients in the most comfortable way possible that works for them. Because especially with traveling, because a lot of these clinical trials we have to travel to go there. And I've noticed that a lot of my testing doesn't do as well because I've been traveling and tired. Or the port's important because it's hard to really hydrate when I'm on the plane because I take a lot of meds that tend to make me have to use the bathroom a lot. So some of those things need to be thought of as well. Like with clinical trial design, it's good to make sure that you have at least a day of time to like recoup and get ready for the testing.
Hallie, I don't know if it's a good time to jump in, kind of thinking again around patient centricity. It really does mean putting that patient, that end user, at the forefront of your thinking as you're beginning to plan out your clinical trial. One of the things we've noticed as a family, and then we've implemented at Canary Advisors through our concierge program, where we support sponsors with patient travels and needs throughout their clinical trial engagement, is that some of these families need some additional support or information. Things like, where is the nearest CVS? How do you access, a place to pick up medications if you need them? What hotels have roll under beds? We have surveyed every hotel in this area of this clinical trial to make sure a Hoyer lift can get under the bed so that when we're staying here, we have access to things like that. And then you might even have patients, we've recently supported a family that had religious obligations. And so we had to locate local places to practice their religion while they're on site for a lengthy clinical trial, as well as specific foods that meet those requirements for those times that they were going to be there. And so, really thinking about the patient as a whole person and thinking about the caregivers as a whole family, siblings, parents, the parents both at home and on site for a clinical trial, thinking about them when you're planning ahead and making sure that you're lessening the burden to the best extent possible.
Hi, I am so sorry about that.
We didn't miss a beat, Hallie, so you can just keep moving.
Catch me up on what I missed. I'm
You didn't. You can go right on to the next question, Hallie. We filled in.
All right.
Well,
Perfect.
before that, Haley, I'd like to add to I think what Jen and Austin's great points on patient centricity. And from my point as a PBM, a pharmacy benefit provider, I represent employers who help get into their employees get into clinical trials. And employers actually have the very same concerns that Austin and Jen voiced. And when we recruit for patient trials, our employers are actually very concerned how we do that and the impact on their members, both before the trial and after trial, and the disruption to their medications, but also just the tenor in what trials and tribulations a patient may have to go through. So I've heard this is great information from Jen and Austin, and I've heard the same thing from our employees. They're very concerned about the patient impact of clinical trials from that perspective. But they also want to be cutting edge, and they also want their employees to take advantage of clinical trials as well. So it's sort of a balance of let's get the right patient into the right clinical trial. Not every clinical trial is right for a given patient. And I think Austin articulated it very well. Geographics is a big part of it. And I think, Austin, you raised a really good point about using a local laboratory versus having to travel a great distance to a particular laboratory. And you work that out. And Jen, as you indicated, a lot of patients aren't like you and Austin that are that savvy to negotiate that process. The same thing, we're trying to recruit more local physicians as well, because many trials can be handled, at least some parts of the care can be handled on a local level if the physician was trained and up to speed and expertise and incentivized in some way to provide some of the care locally as well. So geography, I'll say from my point, as we recruit for patients, is a big part of it. And the last thing I'll say is I think the points Jen and Austin bring home, because we get involved in a lot of rescue trials because they can't get enough patients to participate in clinical trials. So if you don't put the patient front and center, guess what? You may have a very difficult time recruiting as many patients as you want. And I hear all the time from our plan sponsors and pharmaceutical providers that, boy, this trial is running over. It's taking much too long and we're having a difficult recruiting patients. Well, I think we have to build in patient centricity right up front in that trial design. So I wanted to add that as well.
Yeah, Jean, that is a great point. I think you kind of also illuminate the fact that there are countless touch points as somebody navigates healthcare. You're calling your insurance company, you're calling your doctors, you're calling your significant others. You're trying to connect the dots on what this thing in your medical chart means versus what are my next steps? What are my options? But there's also a mountain of noise to kind of break through in today's day and age, even aside from navigating your own healthcare. Even if we look at an individual's health on the whole, that includes mental, emotional, physical health. And I think that's, one of the reasons why Citeline partnership with organizations like Evernorth are so valuable, because together we can start to build those bridges where gaps may have existed before, for facilitating those opportunities to get involved and make sure that they're not missed or overlooked. So that actually brings me to my next question on how, patient-facing organizations, and maybe Jean, you can speak to this a little bit further. I know you just spoke about it, but really seeking to improve clinical trial awareness and education.
Yeah, thank you. So we have several we're always improving at this, and we're getting a little better at educating our patients. And I'll give a good example. So we have one of the largest specialty pharmacies in the world through our organization, and there's many other great specialty pharmacies. But specialty pharmacies are special in that they see a lot of patients with a rare condition again and again and again, these providers. So we have pharmacists that probably handle 50 or so patients with a particular rare condition. That's more than any other pharmacist in the United States would see probably in a lifetime. I'm a practicing pharmacist. They deal with these patients, hemophilia patients, 10 or 15 a day. I've seen like one or two in my career behind the bench. So they're also very engaged with the patients because they have to deliver care to the patient, and they're delivering medications to the patient, and they're answering a lot of questions. So they're very, very patient-centric. And they're very physician-centric. So they're dealing with physicians who are specialists in this area, and they understand the disease, and they're asking the appropriate questions for the physician. So they're a great gatekeeper to help the patient through the process. And we're using those resources within our own company to help get those patients into the appropriate clinical trials too. So as they're working with a patient on their medications, and maybe the medication isn't working, maybe they're having side effects, they're working with a physician routinely. And they also, now we're making them aware of clinical trials make them aware of the clinical trials so that they can be thinking about what trials are important in their clinical practice, and maybe think about referring patients into that as appropriate. So our clinical pharmacists are a great asset, not only to help patients navigate, but also to help physicians in given areas to say, are you aware there's a clinical trial in Boston that's doing this kinds of studies? It sounds like this patient, Jean J, could be a good candidate for that trial. So we're trying to educate our resources that we have internally. I don't deal directly with patients, but these specialist pharmacists deal with patients with complex conditions every day. In fact, patients really generally speaking, interact with a pharmacist more than they do their health plan employer or the physician in many cases. We have a lot of complex patients that are getting lots of medication. So that's one area of education. And then the other I mentioned is we also work with employers, and we call them our plan sponsors, are not the pharmaceutical company, the plan sponsor for a drug study. our plan sponsors are employers, state employers, federal employers, large employers, small commercial employers. And we're also educating them. And there's been I think a kind of a tipping point in the industry, whereas previously when we had discussions with employers, they are very patient-centric, but a little concerned about, well, is the patient going to go out of network for care? And what does this really mean? Is there a disruption to their normal therapy where they do a drug study? And then guess what? The study's over, but the patient can't have that drug that they were getting on the study. Is that going to be a problem? So the tipping point I'm referring to is employers seem to be really activated now around the best care for their patients. And I think we're trying to make clinical trials less of a mystery for employers so that they're more comfortable in promoting that through their organizations for their employers. So that's those are the two things I think we think of first.
Yeah. I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think, what we're seeing nowadays is there's a lot of what I would call maybe non-traditional organizations entering the clinical trial space, really to support better recruitment, better kind of outcomes, better decision-making by patients. But I think a lot of the times that's kind of a mystery on how that all happens or plays out in terms of process. So those examples were really helpful for not only myself, but I hope for our audience as well. Thinking about kind of those touch points, Jen and Austin, I was curious, I know you have such a depth and breadth of experience within the clinical research space. And I'm wondering if, like, in your time navigating many clinical trials, how, like, those maybe often overlooked roadblocks for somebody who may be more trial naive, and how you help to guide them through that process to support kind of awareness and education and making those decisions.
So if we start by thinking about where do patients in the rare community, again, I'm always talking about rare and ultra rare, but where do they get their trial recruitment information, and who do they trust to deliver that? So I think, Jean is bringing up some good points about who's getting involved through the process, but thinking about just original awareness, I'm a huge supporter of sort of that grassroots awareness. We find from working with certain communities, I did some work in the sickle cell community, for example, and I was really thinking about how do we address, how do we reach patients who, historically don't have a lot of trust in the system. They don't want to hear from me, even though I'm a patient and, caregiver in the rare disease community. They're not interested even in talking to me because I'm not in the sickle cell community. And so we learned that you really have to start by presenting the information in digestible formats in places where patients are, by people who patients trust. So I think that's the first part. So people do come to me, especially in the muscular dystrophy community, and say, we have so many choices, right? That's the thing now with some of these rare diseases. We used to have 1 or 2 clinical trial options. Now we might have 40 or 50. And how are patients making those decisions? They're making those decisions by asking people they trust. And so by creating an area or an avenue for education, both from patient advocacy organizations, right? Partnering with advocacy organizations that can share, that can push out this information to their patients, but also making sure that people like genetic counselors and social workers at hospitals, and sometimes, we're talking about church groups where, folks are going to their church groups and may have support groups for their disease state, and they're learning about clinical trials there, right? So we have to make sure that education and those materials are everywhere. When I'm counseling families, and I won't give a recommendation, right? If you've got 5 clinical trials you're thinking about participating in, I'm never going to say this is the one you should do, because I'm not your doctor, right? Your doctor is going to be the best source of that information for you. But I will tell you what questions to ask. And some of the questions I tell patients to ask are, what are the plans for compensation or reimbursement through the study? Does that work for you? What's the schedule of events, and where do you have to go and be, and for how long? Does that work for you? What is their plan, as Jean was mentioning, for after that study is over? Is there a bridge program to commercialization? Is there an extension program? Can you roll over if you've been on placebo? Can you then get drug, right? It's important to understand the trial design in a way that makes sense for you and your family, to know if that trial is going to be the best trial for you. So I always counsel people to ask a lot of questions. Now, people may not like it if you ask a lot of questions, but those are that's the advice that I would give to families when we are making decisions. Obviously, I used to make decisions for my sons, for Austin, Max, but they're both over 18 now. So now I'm bringing the information that I know about a study, and then I'm presenting it to them, and I'm letting them know how much support I can provide, right? Can I travel with you? Can I help you? Can I do some of the maintenance of the engagement with the doctors and the sites? But ultimately, adults living with rare conditions have a whole other set of things to think about. Do they have a trusted care partner that can accompany them to trial site visits? Is there somebody that they can trust to remind them about appointments, or even to administer medications if that's delivered at home? So there's a whole, we're entering a whole new world of that space as well.
Yeah. You bring up a really great point around awareness. I think oftentimes our scope of awareness is limited to, okay, if patients and physicians are aware, that's enough. And it's not enough, and it's also kind of, on the other hand, this idea of how do we equip all of those individuals to, again, ask those questions is critical. And I guess I'm going to ping it over to you, Austin, to ask the question around, as you're looking to decide whether or not to participate in a trial, what are the things that you're looking to know? Is there kind of a list? How do you vet clinical trials?
Yeah. So, for example, one of my current trials that I am in, one of the deciding factors was, would I be able to be hospitalized while I'm getting the treatment? Because there was a lot of issues of worried about there's some possible GI side effects. And so I have really bad GI issues to begin with. So I knew that I was going to have to be hospitalized to be able to manage that, at least for temporarily. So I think that's one example of one thing that I would look into now. Now I also look into travel. How far am I going to have to be traveling? Because recently I've developed motion sickness. So I noticed that's another thing I really have to consider: how far I have to travel, how often I'm going to have to do it, and whether or not I'm able to do some of the testing from home. So those are the big ones. Reimbursement, that's an important one, but my mother's able to help me with that stuff if we really need to do it. So that's not really one of my biggest concerns, but I know that's something that a lot of people have to consider. They also have to consider, the families have to consider babysitting, who they're going to pay to watch kids, if they're going to be able to take off work, and those type of things as well.
Yeah, definitely. Those are all great points. And that kind of leads me into our next kind of topic of discussion, and this next slide that I did want to quickly talk through, just to kind of show the impact. You guys have mentioned the impact in so many different ways, but the downstream impact of patient engagement really can't be overlooked. And I think that's why we are starting to see this industry shift to recognize its importance. But in a study conducted by the NIH, the impact of activities that avoid one protocol amendment and improve enrollment is an increase in net present value of $65 million for phase 3 trials. And that can help to accelerate product launch timelines by almost a year and a half. But more importantly, I think this also is, again, we are able to accelerate the hope that we're providing people who are looking for therapies that can improve the quality of their lives. So as we kind of start to think about this, I actually, we did have a question come through that was relevant to this topic. So I'm going to ask that question to our speakers. Somebody had asked, when we tried to seek communication with patient organizations in the past, and I think really to support that those different avenues for patient engagement, they received pushback due to unavailability of time, shortage of staff, and other reasons. Is there a different avenue that you recommend so that, you know, those individuals who are going out there and really trying to make those connections, but maybe haven't had the best luck, kind of any advice that you would give them?
Sure. I'm not sure who you're directing to right this second, but I can start by saying that's a real consideration, right? We say engage with the patient organizations early, often, right? Even before you decide on a target, right? It's important to understand, is that community, do they have an unmet need? Are they interested in a new drug? Do they want a clinical trial, right? So you do have to start early. But there is such a thing as, you know, kind of that burden on the patient group, especially if we're talking about one patient group for the whole country or the whole world, right? Who are often unpaid staff. They may have one executive director that's probably has the condition you're talking about or has a relative with the condition, right? We know these are mostly family-run organizations. So, you know, to answer your question, what I usually counsel, you know, one of the things that we do with companies is we start as that early patient engagement. So we serve as an advocacy function before they have one. And when we're starting to build those relationships, we don't just reach out and ask for something. So we start by saying, you know, we're interested in this space. We'd love to meet with you. We'd love to talk about our clinical trial with you. We'd like to share where we're going. Is there a way that we can also support your organization? And I hate to say it, but one thing that these little organizations always need is either money resources, or they need a grant to do some more research or to start a registry or to do something that's going to help a sponsor. They may need people on hand to hand out t-shirts at an event, or they may need somebody to set up a fundraiser for them. So finding out what's mutually beneficial is going to get you those relationships. It can't be transactional. It's got to be something where you are offering something in return. So if you're wanting them to set up an advisory board to give feedback or to provide some insights on your protocol or your trial design, you've got to figure out what they need from you. And so setting up those relationships before you have an ask is the way to go. That said, if you have an organization that absolutely doesn't focus on research or isn't interested in clinical trials, that's okay. We have patient leaders that are not members of organizations. And so you might have to dig a little bit deeper. You might have to use a firm or use social media to find those vocal patient leaders. You might have to go to like Global Genes, where I'm going next week, or go to a NORD conference and reach out and look for those kind of very passionate patient leaders and collect some insights from them. But I would say that there is a way where there is a will to engage patients, but you do have to understand that, you know, as a mom of two sons with Duchenne and one with immune deficiency and a full-time job, you know, I want to make sure that if I'm engaging with you, there's a return on my time investment. And that is the same with patient organizations.
Yeah, and Jen, if I may, I'd like to add to that. I think great points there. And we've heard that as well. I think you make some really excellent points. And our view is sort of local in some ways. And by that, I mean, we are able to use the data. If you have a medication that's coming out or you're doing research on a medication, let's find out where the patients are that have that disease. And we can help them find out that population. Maybe in Detroit, for some reason, has a concentration of 50 or 60 of those patients, and it's a rare condition. Then you can translate that to local organizations or to national organizations, but a local presence in that area. So we use the data to help, and we've done this with others. We use the data to help find where concentrations of patients of interest are, so that you can kind of focus your efforts a little bit on those. And that could lead, and this is years before the drug come out. This is when you're doing the study, right? So this is well before a clinical trial starts, but sort of lay the groundwork in those local areas of concentration of patients to help seed that. And as Jen indicated earlier, that could be a soccer coach, that could be a pastor, or it could be a national organization with a presence in a given area. So I think there's a data component that can help lay the groundwork too early on before the clinical trial starts, to kind of seed that local area, and physicians in those local areas as well.
Yeah, definitely. There's something I think to be said, again, going back to our theme today of meeting patients where they are, and just, you know, there are a lot of nuances, and you're going to run into roadblocks, and it may be frustrating at times. So, you know, continue pushing forward and keep trying out those other touch points, because, I think at the end of the day, and maybe Austin, Jean, Jen, you might disagree with me here, but if you can't at the end of the day talk to a patient themselves, it's helpful to talk to the people around them because they may have additional insight that could be helpful as well. In my opinion.
Well, I think you're right. Again, Austin, his bandwidth is limited. He will often tell you, he's at this stage in his life focusing on his health, focusing on doing okay day to day, focusing on things that don't always involve, giving insights on clinical trial designs for 5-year-olds with Duchenne. So that's somewhere where I can pick up, and as a caregiver representative, I can help out. He may have friends or caregivers or care partners from the past. I once ran an advisory board for ALS with almost entirely home nurse caregivers to talk about medicine administration and what the best routes were and what they were currently doing, right? So where there's a will, there's a way, and kind of just throwing up your hands and saying there's no way to collect patient insights or patient input is not the way to do it, because there's always a way. And as you mentioned, and as the screen shows, there's a return on that investment. If you design a study, and I have an example from a Duchenne study a long time ago, there was a study designed where these young boys who often have attention deficit issues and some sensory overload issues there was a study designed where they had to stay in an MRI machine for well over an hour as a 4-year-old, 5-year-old for an imaging study, a full machine. And parents were talking with a pharmaceutical company representative, and they were saying, gee, we cannot recruit this study. Like, we keep having these screen fails and we can't figure out what the problem is. And the problem was that either the site was looking at this patient doing loops around a room, unable to sit still to even, while their parents listened to the study design, or the parent would hear something like has to lay still, non-sedated for over an hour in a machine for an imaging endpoint. And they went, there's no way my kid's going to do that. And they left. And so we were able to share that insight. And thank goodness they didn't just continue on for a year trying to recruit that study. They changed it. And I think they ended up doing a one-arm image for a much shorter period of time. And then the child could be entertained with a movie, and it worked, right? But if they had to, they would have saved money if they had done an ad board and presented that as a potential endpoint. They would have heard from all of us that have had children of that age that, hey, that's not going to work for this age group.
Yeah, that's a great point. And even thinking about, I think there is, you mentioned protocol design there, but also kind of screen failure, which leads more into like the journey into the trial. But then in those recruitment phases, I think ad boards are also really critical for like, what is the messaging that you're sharing that resonates with my community? I know that's something that we do at Citeline, is we've worked with various patient organizations, and this year kicked off a patient advisory board just to make sure that, the technology, the experience from pre-screening to sending all of your information to the site is kind of as seamless as possible, but also like very easy to understand, and giving you also avenues for support. So you're not just left being like, okay, now I need the site to call me and I have questions before then, but like, what do I do? I'm trying to look on clinicaltrials.gov and it's so confusing. And I think that's something that we hear a lot as well, just from the communities that we've interacted with. So I definitely hear you there. Okay. So I did want to get into this topic of data. So clinical research, it really marries kind of the uncertainty of our humanness with the predictability of science, which is really grounded in that data. Yet as we progress as a society, there's a call to better utilize the data available to us. So everything from EHR data for identifying eligible patients to the I believe it's around 3.6 million data points that are captured in an average phase 3 trial that's validating the safety and efficacy of those therapies. Yet there is still also, I think, an opportunity to create a better feedback mechanism. So those potential uncertainties of our humanness and the full picture of someone's medical history can help them and their physicians make optimal decisions about their care. So my next question, and Jean, I might pass this to you first, is how can data be harnessed to address trial burden and promote transparency?
Excellent question. I'm glad you asked that. And I think first I'll start with there's three kinds of data that I think of generally. There's claims data, and we have billions of claims data. That means this patient got this got this drug at this time, and they went from drug A to drug B. By the way, they have medical diagnosis of 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's claims data, which we have reams of. And then there's, you mentioned earlier, Haley, electronic medical record data. And that's a little different. That's different from claims data. And what's important about EMR data is it includes observations from the physician, either the pathology report, the lab report, some insights that don't appear on claims data. So that's a very important point too. But the third part, and maybe as important or more important than the other, is Dr. Mom, I think, as Jen indicated. So there's patient and family caregiver information that needs to be ascertained for data, which is important. I think, Jen, I love your conversation. You're not going to find in a medical claim or an EMR anywhere that says, well, my kid has ADD and they're not going to be able to, my kid's not going to be able to sit still for 15 minutes to go through that study. That's not going to show up on a claim anywhere, and it probably is not going to show up in EMR. We'll see a claim for ADD or some other conditions, but it really doesn't give insight into the actual patient. So firstly, when I think of data, I think of those three domains. Now, I don't live in that third domain, the Dr. Mom domain. It would be great if we did. I'll say we don't have that, and a lot of institutions really don't have that data in detail. But we do have claims data. And with claims data, and we also have demographic data, and we have social determinants of health information, which can be also very, very important. So those considerations when we help a plan sponsor, that is a drug company or a CRO, recruit patients, we always look at we glean as much as we can from the inclusion exclusion criteria. So when the patient gets to the screening part, it's like, oh, you screened out because you had drug A in your history and you can't have drug A. And you need to be on drug B and you can't be on drug A. And by the way, you can't have disease 1, 2, 3. Well, they had that in their distant history 3 years ago. They had an asthma episode that could rule the patient out. So as much data, and we have a lot of data, and we apply all that data when we contact a patient as a potential for a clinical site. So you want to use medical data, you want to use pharmacy data. If you have EMR data, that's important to bring to bear as well. And then geographic data. So we have data on the patients. We get our primary eligibility from the employer. And that's why our employers are important stakeholders. They're very concerned of how we reach out to patients and who we reach out to. So that bit of data, though, is, as Austin indicated, you don't want a patient, you want a patient that's proximal to where the clinical site is going to be, and who the doctors are in that area. So we use data for the inclusion, exclusion, geography data that's important to help really drill down, okay, of the 5,000 patients we have with this particular condition, here are the 100 that are very close to a clinical site. And here's a really good 100 patients that we think this study is going to be a good fit for the patient, and it's going to be a good fit for the plan sponsor, the pharma company who's sponsoring the trial, because they're proximal to that. And then when that patient gets to the screening site, it's not okay, well, I went through 2 hours of screening only to find out the site is going to be 100 miles away, or they're going to do things to me that I rule myself out because I had condition A, condition B, not on the right medications. So I think from a pure data analytics perspective, piling into that data before we recruit a patient for a given study is critical from our standpoint.
Yeah. I feel like, that time up front can help save time later on for more stakeholders, actually, just in terms of, not knowing sooner whether somebody is actually eligible or not. I guess, Austin, we have this slide up on the screen around kind of patients' perspectives on data that actually matters to them. So I was wondering if you could perhaps speak to kind of the data that maybe matters to you within clinical research, or how you would like to receive kind of results from the trials that you've participated, or maybe what your experience has been like in the past.
Data that I feel is really important is, as being someone that's non-ambulatory, it's important that they're looking at data and data of things that I can do that doesn't involve walking. Like a lot of stuff required cardiac MRIs to look at my heart and my cardiac function or my pulmonary function, to look at that as valuable data. And I think the other part is whether or not it improves my quality of life. That's another one. That one's really hard to quantify, but I think quality of life is important. Like if the study and to get that data is taking away from my everyday life and not bringing quality to it, then I think that's not very valuable.
That's a great point that you make. Jen, I'm wondering if you've seen any kind of unique approaches to collecting more of that quality of life data. I know patient-reported outcomes are huge these days. And yeah, I was curious on your thoughts there.
Yeah, so I wanted to add on just quickly about returning patient data, because I think that's important and I wanted to squeeze it in. A lot of times, like with our lives, you're participating in a clinical trial for a decade or more, especially with these gene therapy studies, especially with studies that have long-term observations, first in human, et cetera. And so the testing that Austin mentioned, things like cardiac MRIs and pulmonary function testing and functional assessments, are being taken at these trial visits. And so I'm a huge supporter, and I will say it whenever I can, of returning that data to the families so they don't have to go repeat those data endpoints at their clinic. A lot of times care during a clinical trial is one of the perks, right? So getting those advanced testing, if you don't have insurance that covers a cardiac MRI, but you're getting one as part of the study, you've got to give that data back to the patient's own cardiologist so they can make care and treatment decisions based on that too. So I wanted to squeeze that in there because I think it's becoming increasingly important. If you're asking us to come to a study site, every couple of months, then getting a clinic visit in 2, 3, 4 times a year, that burden is doubled. But if you can offer that, hey, we're going to do these assessments at the study site and provide that back to your care team, that's an added benefit, and that will keep you in the study. That will be a compliance thing. It's really an incentive to say, hey, we're going to cover these testing throughout the years as long as we have the data for our study. So that's one piece. And then thinking about patient-reported outcomes, I'm going to do a quick plug for my team at Canary, only because we just launched a program where we're collecting via qualitative interviews patient-reported outcomes for studies. And that is directly working with patient families. Sometimes it's parents, sometimes it's patients themselves, to collect those quality of life measures that Austin's talking about. We know the FDA is really focused on how a patient feels and functions as part of the review of the data. We know that Congress mandates them to include patient experience data into their review and hopeful approval. They have advisory committee hearings, and they have mechanisms like PFDD meetings throughout drug development process that patients can weigh in. But what is better than interviewing and talking with families who are participating in a study to find out if this study indeed changed their quality of life outside of the clinic? An example I'll give is that we recently worked with a team to design a patient-reported outcomes or qualitative interview study for patient experience. And we found out that not only were these kids walking a little better as part of the study, right? Walking a little further, maybe in 6 minutes, going up the stairs better. But that also meant that these families didn't have to move to houses that were one floor. They didn't have to change schools. Maybe they were at, some of the kids were at parochial schools where there were no elevators. And so the fact that they could still use stairs meant they might complete their years there at that school. They were traveling more, and they were able to enjoy life as a family a little bit more because, not needing a wheelchair to travel and being able to walk was a huge benefit to these families. They had more energy, and they were able to really enjoy being a family more. And those are things you're not going to find during a clinical trial with traditional clinical endpoints. So it really is kind of that additional color. And I think that's, as Austin mentioned, to the patient, especially the adult patient, if they're going to have the burden of being part of a study, on the other end, they want it to improve their quality of life. That's what they're interested in overall. And so we do have to capture that if we're going to be able to show it.
Yeah, that's a great point that you make. And I think, we've been talking about the full spectrum of clinical development, which I think is really cool in this context. Just in terms of understanding the areas that somebody should be thinking about even if it doesn't directly impact their day-to-day work. But, is somebody else doing something or not doing something that could affect the way that I'm able to do my job? And I think that's something our team is thinking about a lot, just, as we look to build solutions that address the multiple challenges of stakeholders, because, sites have their own challenges as well. I think clinical research organizations have different challenges. So all of those, and then physicians, which we had also mentioned earlier, all have different challenges. But, I think one of the things that we've really started to find is really pivotal is like bringing together those networks of individuals, because they exist out there, but maybe aren't centralized. And I think that gets into my next topic of discussion, which we will spend just a bit of time here, but I do have a little bit of interactive whiteboarding that we're going to do in the last 5 minutes of really this topic around how collaboration can facilitate innovation. And I think there are a lot of ways that you can go about this. There's a lot of ways that people are trying to solve these problems in terms of providing these different avenues for folks to engage with one another, to really understand what those nuances in each stage of participation are, or maybe in other areas of that entire kind of healthcare journey. So this is my little cartoon on collaboration, and I'm really hoping, again, I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen and flip to, and then reshare my screen. So hopefully my internet holds up this time, so that we can, in our last 5 minutes, Jean, Austin, and Jen, share one action a clinical trial sponsor or any stakeholder involved in research can take today to meet patients, their loved ones, and their communities where they are. So before anyone answers, let me flip my screen over. And again, thanks everyone for bearing with the few issues that I've had today. All right. Okay, let me get this back into a different mode and reshare. Oh. Nothing like watching somebody fumble around on her screen. All right. So we're going to go into our good old tried and true PowerPoint mode, but more just the regular version so that I can jot down your next steps so that we can really see those clearly. And everyone here, if you have questions about how to achieve those next steps, you can ask us and we can address those in the last few minutes that we have together. So Jen, Jean, Austin, anyone who wants to volunteer to go first?
I'll jump in with one, since and that is, and I think we talked about this, is go local. So as much as we can do for patients on a local level, so that's educating the local physicians, that's also prepping that groundwork where a concentration of patients may be before the study begins, or if that's national. But to help patients overcome barriers they may have, Jen mentioned some barriers earlier, to doing a drug study. I don't want to be a guinea pig, I've heard before from patients and things like that, and to really educate about what clinical trials are, and educate local pastors and soccer moms and soccer coaches and basketball coaches. I think at a local level, and get involved with local communities, I think is an important aspect to getting good results. So that prep work, that hard prep work, done well before a study is begun.
Yeah, definitely. Jen, Austin.
All right, I'll go next. I'm going to say, because we don't know who our audience is today. I don't know what your function within your company is. If you're a pharmaceutical sponsor and you could be in research and clinical, you could be an executive, but I believe that everybody needs to be wearing their patient hat, right? We've all been or will be patients at some point. So what I would say is today, look at what you're working on, whether you're designing some communications that are going to be in the hands of a trial participant, whether you are planning that trial, you're designing a protocol, you're thinking about how many injections this child has to have, or how many times they have to visit a site. Wear your patient hat today as you're navigating your role in the company, and try to make one change that lessens the burden, or makes something clearer, or makes something more patient-centric. And I really don't like the phrase patient-centric, because I think it's overused and under-demonstrated. But really think about what's one thing you can do to make a patient's life better in the role that you're filling at your sponsor company, and do that. I think that action is incredibly important, and thinking like a patient, thinking like a human being, like Austin and I, who are now looking at the weather and scrambling to figure out flights so that we can get back home, right? Think like a patient, think like a person that has to think about their next step and make a change.
I love that.
Yeah, so one of the ones that I thought is really important is to not just consider accommodations of the group as a whole and generalize, but be prepared to have to provide specific accommodations to each individual, because all of them have different barriers and challenges to making the trial feasible for them.
Is there a time, Austin? Actually, I'm curious that I know you mentioned the example earlier on about the blood draws, but wondering if there's any other examples that you could share, just in terms of be prepared to provide individual care.
Yeah, so one of the things that with traveling is I need a shower chair. I'm not able to use the adaptive chairs that they have in hotels. So a shower chair is one of those, because I need it to be able to use the bathroom and also be able to go in the shower. So depending on the duration of a trial, that's another example of accommodation that I would need.
Definitely.
So thinking about how to make somebody's stay in another state work for them is really important to Austin. Yeah.
I definitely respect that. I feel like that is, especially as you're going through kind of medical procedures and all of that kind of just stuff, being comfortable is so important. And I think that goes back to wearing your patient hat as you are making decisions in your day-to-day work is critical. We do have 3 minutes left. Thank you all for taking a moment to whiteboard with me. We did have a question. This one might be a fun one just on these last few minutes. Somebody said, I know, this is for Austin, by the way. I know that you are good at navigating life through humor. Do you have any hilariously bad clinical trial experiences that you'd like to share?
I don't think at this time it would be best to make jokes about clinical trials.
Fair.
Austin, you could share, and I'm being a typical mom and jumping in, but thinking about things that weren't funny then, but are funny now. We had an experience when Austin was very much younger, and he was part of a clinical trial. And we landed in our clinical trial site, and he's of course a wheelchair user, and there was no van there to pick us up. And so in a panic, we called the only nurse in the middle of the night that we had a cell phone number for, Nurse Candy. And Nurse Candy and her husband showed up with McDonald's for the family in their own personal van, and were prepared to lift the wheelchair if they had to get it into their van and to get us where we needed to be. So I would just say it wasn't funny at the time. I was very pregnant with my daughter, and Austin was tired, and we were miserable. But now looking back on it, it shows that those humans that come to your aid during a study, it takes everybody. Everybody's got to roll up their sleeves. But if you have the humans to come in, you can make it through just about anything. And we still love Nurse Candy, and I still keep in touch with her.
That's awesome. It's always, I think, hindsight is always 2020. Maybe we feel that in our day-to-day roles as we gather more experience that helps us to make better decisions in a day-to-day. I know we have 1 minute left, so I just wanted to say a tremendous thank you to Jean, Austin, and Jen. So much appreciate your insights that you've shared today. And to our audience as well, thank you for your eagerness to build stronger bridges to patients by spending some of your valuable time with us today as well. So please do not hesitate to reach out after this webinar to myself, to Jen, maybe not at this time, Jen and Austin, because you are traveling right now, but once the dust settles a little bit, reach out. And Jean, of course, please connect with him. We are, all a wealth of knowledge, and would love to hear from you. So thank you, everyone. Any last parting words? I think we're probably going to get kicked off here in a minute.
Thanks for having us.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having us. Bye.
Thank you.